3 years ago, I thought Me Too was just a hashtag. And honestly, when Silence is Not Spiritual came across my email, I knew many of these women were my friends. And I thought, this is really not that big of a deal, to be honest with you. And so I did. I thought Me Too was just a hashtag. It was just a creation of social media. And in my naivete, I thought, what is the big deal? And within months, I came to learn more about the insidious nature of abuse and small steps of trust that were involved in grooming in my own experience. And in 2017, Me Too became a reckoning with the truth about my former pastor, friend, mentor, leader, and close family friend. Elie Wiesel, who is a Nobel laureate and a Holocaust survivor, said, "I swore to never be silent when human beings endure suffering and humiliation. We must take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Sometimes we must interfere." So one night in a hotel room in Sweden in February of 1998, my former pastor, Bill Hybels, called me up to his room to discuss leadership, which was a common thing. He offered me wine, career advancement, and then detailed what he liked about my personality, my leadership, my body in great detail. And then he told me my husband was not my caliber and kissed me. That night, I remember getting to the door and holding onto the doorknob. I could feel myself coming apart at the seams. And I heard the voice of the Holy Spirit say, "Get out of this room. And if you don't, you will be destroyed." I got out into the hallway and I crumbled into the floor weeping and went back to my room and silently went to bed with my roommate in the bed next to me. That night, I listened to the voice of the Holy Spirit. I refused his advances and confronted him the next morning. I warned him not to do it again. Shortly afterward, I told my husband and my mom, "You tell your mother these things, right?" And so I told my husband and my mother and a handful of close friends, 2 of whom were sitting elders at Willow Creek at the time. I did what I was taught to do. I confronted him. I followed Matthew 18. And I assumed it was a lapse of judgment and believed the best. I believed that these were weak moments in the life of a man that I otherwise trusted and respected at the time. I also believed I was doing the right thing, the kind of thing a true friend would do when I called a meeting with him in the year, it was around 2001, and told him that I noticed a particular sexual type of energy from him whenever he was around 5 specific women, 2 of them being Nancy Beach and Nancy Ortberg, and I warned him to knock it off. He said that he understood. We sat in silence. I remember what I was wearing, and I remember sweating through my shirt as I left his office that day. But before I left and sat there in his office, I looked over at the doorway of his office to his former assistant's desks, and I randomly asked him, "Whatever happened to Pat Baranowski?" His assistant of 6 years, who had just seemed to have disappeared. And he said, "Oh, she's crazy. She stalked me." Within a year of that confrontation, I was exiled to the same windowless office Pat Baranowski had been placed in 10 years prior, before being fired. All 3 of these women mentioned later became an important part of my Me Too, Church 2 story. The reckoning with truth began when I received a letter in a pink envelope from my friend and former elder, Betty Schmidt, in May of 2017, letting me know that there had been an investigation reopened into Bill Hybels' sexual conduct with multiple women, and that she had remembered my story of how Bill had kissed me in Sweden. Over time, I learned the details of other women's allegations and realized that many odd encounters, phrases, notes in code, tactics, invitations to be alone for leadership discussions, and the seeming lapses in character were actually 40-year patterns of perpetration upon many women. And that in reality, I had been intentionally groomed to perpetrate it and then discarded when I got too close to the truth. I was not the only one. It happened to me, too. In 2017, I discovered that my former pastor was still pursuing a woman who was young enough to be my daughter. As a mother of 2 teenage girls, I imagined what I would do if this were happening to them. And the mother bear in me came out, and I thought, I have to stand in the gap. I knew that I had a choice to make. I did not want to come forward. I did not want to be the one to speak. But for the sake of the purity and the integrity of the church that I love, and for the protection of past and future women who might potentially be victimized, I soon realized that I would need to have courage to speak up, even if it meant losing everything. Some days, it feels as though I almost have. Coming forward was the hardest, most challenging, painful, life-altering decision I have ever had to make. What it has cost me is immeasurable. I had no idea that the church that I loved would not believe me and the 9 other women as claims mounted. I had no idea that the church would continue to believe the pastor in question, even though years of allegations had been swirling and brought to their attention, with no action taken. I did not imagine they would assassinate my character publicly. I was naive and could not imagine being persecuted, slandered, lied about, and continually bullied by the church on a global scale for reasons I may never fully know. I did not know how crushing it would be to come forward and the effects this would have on my marriage, my family, my health, my friendships, and my work. I did not imagine that I would be standing here today to confront widespread clergy abuse in the church. You know, it takes so much for a person to come forward. And you know, today we are specifically talking about women coming forward, but in the last 2 years, I probably received 2 to 3 stories that come to me each week. And friends, it is not just women. It is our children. It is our daughters and our sons. It is men. It is boys who grow up to be men. And it is women. It is happening at alarming rates. The stories would lead me to believe this. The chance that a person is lying about an accusation of sexual harassment and or sexual abuse is very small. Most reports state that only 2 to 8% of those claims are even false. In my case, the odds that 10 women who have similar accusations of sexual misconduct and abuse by the same person, following the same patterns, in 4 successive decades, all falsely accusing the man, would be virtually statistically impossible. Today, we are asking what the church should do when allegations of sexual misconduct arise. We must also ask ourselves, why is sexual misconduct by pastors and church leaders happening in the first place? I've been recently reading 1 Timothy and weeping through most of it on most days, because Paul constantly and consistently calls leaders in the church to live lives above reproach, to be faithful in their marriages, to be self-controlled and respectable, to set an example for other believers in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, and in purity. And he also calls churches to publicly reprove and reprimand leaders who sin. When it's a viable accusation brought by 2 or 3 witnesses, to serve as a warning. This is a warning not only to the person who is perpetrating, it's a warning to perpetrators in the church, it's a warning to those being perpetrated, and it's a warning to those who are naive about the fact that it is even going on in their midst. Maybe the reason this is happening on such a massive level in the church, both in the evangelical and in the Catholic Church, is because the church has failed in its biblical responsibility to call out sin and to hold leaders to the high standard of behaviors that Jesus requires by the power of his Holy Spirit dwelling inside of them. In light of this, what can we do in our churches to handle this right? These are just a few things that I want to share with you coming directly from my experience. Take the allegations of sexual misconduct seriously. Whether it's misconduct, whether it is full abuse, it is ruinous to the lives of the people that it happens to. Create a safe and protected place for the person to share their story in an environment where there is a person in authority who's able to act upon the next steps that are needed in a neutral fashion. A vast majority of the time, the accuser is telling the truth. That said, do not try to handle the allegations internally. As you can see in our situation, the church was unwilling to agree to a formal neutral investigation since 2014. And so what happened as a result is many, many processes of internal investigation with investigators that were hired by the organization itself to protect the organization were leading those internal investigations. And then when our allegations became public, then we were publicly asked to conciliate through an association of evangelical leaders first, and then again by the new elder team at Willow Creek. None of them got to the source of the problem. Do a thorough and independent, neutral outside investigation. Do not attempt to handle it internally and thereby further victimize those making claims. Third, do not attempt to make any initial private or public statements about the innocence of the perpetrator in question. The nuances of abuse are highly complex and hidden. It is the full intention of predators to create safeguards in place to keep their actions hidden so that they cannot be traced or brought to light. Then, once the truth is discovered, tell the congregation about what happened and resist the temptation to spin it or protect the reputation of your church and the offending leader. If the spiritual leader has sinned, call it what it is and call it out publicly. If you have mishandled an allegation and have wounded a victim of clergy abuse, do everything in your power to make a true apology and to make amends. If the harm was done publicly, apologize publicly and specifically for how you harmed that person and what you did to harm them. Then do whatever you can to make things right with the victim of the abuse. Care for them. Help them find healing and personal restoration and make restitution if it's appropriate. Lastly, if statistics are correct, there are probably leaders in this room struggling with some form of addiction. If you are a leader struggling with patterns of abuse, addiction, pornography, deceit, I beg you to come out of hiding. I beg you to let therapists and churches love you and help you recover the wreckage that you are causing in your own life and the lives of those that you are wounding. If you read my social media, you can see it gets pretty wiry on there. But it has been a desire from day one that I lift up the truth, that I keep lifting up the truth in the power of Christ and not engage in bullying that I have received, both online and personally. So that said, I will continue to advocate for the survivors. I will continue to advocate for the purity of the gospel lived out among us. I will continue to advocate for the integrity of leaders in the church, for them to live and lead by the Spirit and not by patterns of their broken and false selves. To the church, I want to say, we can do better. We must do better. Our responsibility as leaders is to love the bride of Christ and present her to Jesus without blemish, stain, or wounding. I cannot unsee and unknow what I have learned in the last 2 years about systemic abuse in the evangelical churches of our American civilized society. This is our horror. We must address it. We must confess it. We must denounce the actions of leaders who perpetrate it. We must not tolerate it. We must model the character of Christ as we deal with it. We must hold hard things in tension. We must bring healing to the broken with merciful justice. We must not be silent any longer.